A feral wind howled through Kamchatka's pines at -45 degrees Celsius when lone Elena Mirova caught a chilling cry cutting the night. She braved the blizzard, flung open her shed, and froze. 3 bear cubs, trembling, motherless, on death's edge. One mad choice sparked it all. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The wind screamed through the pines, a feral howl that clawed at the edges of Elena Mirova's wooden cabin, buried deep in the wilds of Kamchatka. It was a sound that could freeze blood, sharp, relentless, carrying the bite of -45 degrees Celsius. Snow swirled outside, a white shroud swallowing the world beyond her frost-crusted window. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the room. Elena sat motionless, her gnarled hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea long gone cold, her breath a faint cloud in the dim light. She was 78, her face etched with lines of a life lived hard and alone, but her eyes, sharp, gray, unyielding, burned with something the years couldn't steal. Solitude was her fortress, silence her shield. Until that sound pierced through it all. It came like a knife through the storm, a thin, desperate wail, fragile yet insistent, rising above the wind's fury. Elena froze. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a dull, heavy beat. The wind, number 2 alive, too raw. A wounded fox, maybe. A wolf snared in some forgotten trap? She strained to listen, her head tilting toward the cracked window pane. No, this was different. Younger, more afraid. Something helpless. Something dying. The thought sank into her bones, cold and heavy, stirring a memory she'd buried long ago. The last cry of her husband, Ivan, as sickness took him, leaving her to face this wilderness alone. She'd fled the village then, abandoned the chatter of people for the mountain's brutal embrace. But now that sound dragged her back, pulling at a thread of her soul she thought had snapped. She stood, joints creaking like the old floorboards beneath her boots. The mug clattered onto the table, tea sloshing over the rim. Her thickest coat hung by the door, woolen bear fur, patched from years of wear. She yanked it on, her fingers stiff but quick, and grabbed the lantern from its hook. The flame danced wildly as she lit it, casting her shadow long and jagged against the wall. She hesitated at the door, hand on the latch, the wind's howl daring her to step out. "Foolish old woman," she muttered, her voice a rasp lost in the storm. But the cry came again, fainter now, fading. She couldn't ignore it. Not tonight. The door swung open, and the cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, clawing through layers of fabric to grip her skin. Snow stung her face, 1,000 tiny needles, and the wind shoved against her, as if warning her back. Each step was a war, boots sinking into knee-deep drifts, the lantern swaying, its light barely cutting through the swirling white. She moved toward the sound, her pulse hammering in her ears, drowning out the storm's roar. It was louder now, closer, pulling her past the skeletal pines to the storage shed at the forest edge, a rickety thing of warped wood and rusted nails, half buried in snow. Her breath hitched. That's where it was coming from. Her hands, numb and trembling, fumbled with the icy latch. The wind yanked at her coat, tearing at her resolve, but she grit her teeth and pulled. The door groaned, then flew open with a crack, slamming against the shed's side. Elena raised the lantern, its glow spilling into the dark, and she gasped, a sound swallowed by the gale. There, huddled in a shivering heap on the frozen ground, were 3 tiny bear cubs. Their fur was matted with ice, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their wide, terrified eyes glinting in the flickering light. They whimpered, soft, broken sounds that clawed at her chest. 3 fragile lives teetering on the edge of death. She knew what this meant. Their mother was gone. Poachers, most likely, ruthless men who roamed these woods, hunting for pelts and trophies, leaving orphans in their wake. Without her, these cubs wouldn't survive the night, let alone the week. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would be to shut the door, stumble back to her cabin, and call the rangers in the morning. Let nature run its course. That's what Yvonne would have done, practical to a fault. But Elena wasn't Yvonne. She'd never been practical when it mattered most. She knelt, the snow soaking through her pants, chilling her knees. The cubs stared at her, their breaths shallow puffs in the frigid air. One, the smallest, let out a weak cry, its head drooping. Elena's throat tightened. She saw herself in those eyes, alone, abandoned, clinging to a world that didn't care. She'd walked away from people, from society because they'd failed her. But these cubs, they hadn't failed anyone. They'd just been born into a cruel, indifferent wild. "Damn it," she whispered, her voice shaking. Not from cold, but from something deeper, something she couldn't name. She set the lantern down, its light pooling around her, and reached out a trembling hand. The cubs flinched, but they didn't growl, didn't snap. Too weak, maybe, or too scared. "Come on, little one," she said, softer now, the words catching in her throat. "Let's get you warm." It was madness. She knew it. Bears weren't pets, weren't strays to take in. They were wild, dangerous, unpredictable. If they lived, they'd outgrow her, outgrow this shed, outgrow her kindness. And yet, as she scooped the smallest one into her arms, its body limp, its fur cold against her chest, she didn't care. The other two watched, trembling, as she stood. "You're coming too," she told them, her voice firm despite the quiver in it. She'd carry them all if she had to. The wind roared as she turned back toward the cabin, the smallest cub cradled against her, the other two stumbling behind on shaky legs. Each step was heavier than the last, the storm fighting her every inch. But she pushed on, driven by a fire she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what she was starting, didn't know the danger, the bond, the miracles that waited ahead. All she knew was the weight in her arms, the faint heartbeat against her own, and the promise she made in that frozen moment. She wouldn't let them die. Inside the cabin, she kicked the door shut. The wind's howl muffled at last. The fire sputtered as she laid the cubs before it, their tiny bodies dwarfed by the hearth. They shivered, curling into each other, and Elena sank to her knees beside them, her breath ragged. She didn't have a plan, didn't have supplies for this. But as she draped an old blanket over them, watching their eyes flutter with the first hints of warmth, she felt something shift inside her, a crack in the ice that had held her heart for decades. This was the beginning of what she couldn't say. But as the storm raged on outside, Elena Mirova knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. The cabin smelled of pine and damp fur, a strange, earthy warmth that clung to the air as the fire crackled in the hearth. Elena Mirova sat cross-legged on the floor, her back stiff from hours of stillness, her gray eyes locked on the three bear cubs huddled beneath the tattered blanket. Their shivering had stopped, replaced by shallow, steady breaths that rose and fell in unison. Yuri, the smallest, lay curled in a tight ball, his nose tucked under a paw. Sasha, with her patchy fur and sharp little ears, sprawled beside him, one leg twitching in sleep. Misha, the boldest, stared back at her, his dark eyes glinting with a quiet defiance that made her chest ache. They were alive. Against all odds, they'd made it through the night. Elena hadn't slept. The storm still battered the cabin, rattling the walls like a beast clawing to get in. But inside, time felt suspended, a fragile bubble holding her and these wild intruders. She'd fed them what she could, a mix of oats and the last of her dried fish. Mashed into a crude paste, they'd eaten greedily, tiny tongues lapping at her fingers, their warmth seeping into her cold hands. It was reckless, she knew, feeding bears, inviting them into her home. She could hear Ivan's voice in her head, stern and practical. "Elena, they're not yours to keep. They'll turn on you." But Ivan wasn't here. He'd left her to face the world alone, and these cubs, orphaned by the same cruel wilderness that had taken him, were hers now, at least for tonight. Morning broke gray and bitter, the wind dying to a low moan. Elena stood, joints popping, and peered out the window. Snow stretched endless beyond the pines, a frozen sea swallowing any trace of the world beyond. No rangers would come, not in this. She was on her own, and so were they. She turned back to the cubs. They were awake now, stumbling over each other, pawing at the blanket with clumsy curiosity. Misha let out a soft grunt, nosing at the hearth's edge, and Elena felt a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. All right, she muttered, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. Let's see how long we can do this. Days bled into weeks, each one a dance of survival and stubborn will. Elena named them properly, whispering their names like a secret to the wind. Yuri, after her father's gentle strength. Sasha, for the sister she'd lost to fever. Misha, for the boy she taught decades ago, fearless and wild. She built a routine around them, feeding them scraps of whatever she had, coaxing them with soft words, watching them grow. They wrestled by the fire, tumbling over each other in bursts of energy that filled the cabin with life. Yuri learned to climb her leg, his tiny claws pricking her skin. Sasha gnawed at the table's edge, leaving jagged marks Elena didn't mind. Misha prowled the room, testing boundaries, his growls deepening with each passing day. They were hers but not hers, wild spirits tethered to her by chance and necessity. She never forgot what they were. Every morning she bundled them in her arms and trudged outside, setting them in the snow to play, to dig, to learn. The cold bit at her lungs, but she stood watch, her rifle slung over her shoulder, not to harm them, but to protect them from the shadows that lurked beyond the trees. Poachers still roamed these woods. She'd seen their tracks once, fresh and deep, too close to her land. The cubs needed to know the wild, needed to be ready. She taught them to paw at the earth, to sniff the air, to listen for danger. "You're not pets," she'd say, her voice firm but breaking at the edges. "You're bears. Remember that." But at night, when the frost turned the windows to glass and the world outside fell silent, they returned to her. They'd curl up by the fire, their soft breathing a rhythm that matched her own. She'd sit beside them, mending clothes or carving wood, stealing glances at their sleeping forms. It was a comfort she hadn't known she craved, a quiet companionship that filled the void Ivan's death had carved. She'd catch herself smiling, a rare, fleeting thing, and wonder how she'd let them in so deep. Then Ivan, the other Ivan, came. Her closest neighbor, a retired ranger with a grizzled beard and a limp, trudged through the snow one afternoon, his knock heavy on her door. She opened it, the cubs tumbling behind her, and his eyes widened. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" He stepped inside, boots dripping meltwater, and the cubs froze, staring at him. Misha growled low, a sound that vibrated through the floor. Ivan ignored it, his gaze fixed on her. "They'll outgrow you. They'll turn. You think you can tame bears?" "They're not tame," she snapped, her hands curling into fists. "I'm giving them a chance. That's all." Ivan shook his head, his face a map of worry and doubt. "A chance? They're wild, Ella. They don't belong here. And when they're big enough to kill you, what then?" He pointed at Misha, who bared his teeth. "That one's already got murder in his eyes." Elena's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand, that these cubs weren't just animals, they were a lifeline, a reason to keep going. But she only smiled, thin and sharp. "Then I'll have given them something," she said. "That's all any of us need." Ivan sighed, muttering under his breath, and left her with a warning she couldn't shake. "Spring's coming. They'll leave, or worse." He was right about spring. The snow began to melt, dripping from the eaves in slow, steady tears. The air softened, carrying the scent of wet earth and budding pines. The cubs grew, fast. Their paws thickened, their fur darkened, their play turned rougher. Yuri could scramble up her shelves now, knocking over jars. Sasha's teeth left gouges in the doorframe. Misha's growls deepened, echoing through the cabin like distant thunder. They were stronger, wilder, and Elena felt the shift, a pull toward the forest she couldn't fight. One morning, she woke to find them at the door, pawing at it, their noses pressed to the crack. The sun was rising, painting the snow gold, and the trees beyond whispered with new life. Her heart sank. She knew what this meant. 3 months had passed. 3 months of warmth, of trust, of something she couldn't name, and now it was time. She opened the door, the cold air rushing in, and they bounded out, tumbling into the snow with a joy that broke her. She followed, her boots crunching behind them, her rifle forgotten inside. They ran ahead, weaving through the pines, their bodies blending into the wild. She watched, her throat tight, her eyes burning. "Go," she whispered, though they couldn't hear. "Be free." Misha turned once, his dark eyes meeting hers, and then he was gone, swallowed by the trees with Yuri and Sasha at his heels. Elena stood there, alone again, the silence heavier than ever. She told herself she wouldn't cry. She did anyway, hot, silent tears that froze on her cheeks. She trudged back to the cabin, the emptiness settling into her bones. The blankets still lay by the fire, marked with their scent. She sank beside it, her fingers tracing the frayed edges, and wondered if Ivan was right, if she'd been a fool to let them in. But as she stared into the flames, a shadow flickered outside the window. Brief, fleeting, gone before she could be sure. Her breath caught. Were they still out there? Watching? Waiting? She didn't know. Not yet. But something told her this wasn't the end. Not for her and not for them. The cabin felt hollow without them. 3 years had crept by since the cubs vanished into the pines, their paw prints fading under fresh snow, their growls swallowed by the wind. Elena Mirova had rebuilt her days around solitude, chopping wood, mending nets, watching the seasons turn from her porch. The blanket they'd slept on still hung by the hearth, its edges frayed but untouched, a quiet relic of a winter she couldn't forget. She'd catch herself staring at it some nights, the fire's glow dancing in her gray eyes, wondering if Yuri, Sasha, and Misha had survived the wild. She told herself they had, hoped they had, but the forest kept its secrets, and she'd learned long ago not to ask questions it wouldn't answer. That evening, the air was sharp with coming frost, the sky bruising purple over the trees. Elena stepped outside to fetch water, her boots crunching on a thin sheet of ice near the well. The bucket swung in her hand, heavy with routine, her breath curling in the cold. She was older now, slower, her bones aching with every step, but she moved with the stubborn grace of someone who'd outlasted worse. The wind whispered through the pines a familiar song, and she paused to listen. No birds, no rustle of life, just silence. Too deep, too still. Her grip tightened on the bucket. Something was wrong. She turned back toward the cabin, her shadow stretching long across the snow. Then it happened. Fast, brutal, a slip on the ice that sent her crashing down. Pain exploded up her leg, a sickening crack splitting the quiet. The bucket flew from her hand, water spilling dark against the white. She gasped, clutching her shin, her fingers finding the jagged edge of bone beneath her skin. Broken. Badly. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled, dropping her back into the snow with a cry she couldn't stifle. The cold seeped in, fast and merciless, numbing her hands, her face. She was alone, miles from anyone. The temperature was plummeting. She'd die out here if she didn't move. "Help!" she croaked, her voice weak, lost to the wind. Who would hear? Ivan, the ranger, lived too far, and he hadn't visited in months. She clawed at the snow, dragging herself toward the cabin, each inch a battle against pain and fading strength. Her coat snagged on a root, tearing open, letting the cold bite deeper. Minutes stretched into eternity, her breath shallow, her vision blurring at the edges. She saw Ivan, her Ivan, his face pale and still in their old bed, his last words a plea to keep going. "I'm trying," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. But her arms gave out, and she collapsed, the snow cradling her like a grave. Then, a sound, low, heavy, a crunch of paws on ice. Elena's heart lurched. She lifted her head, squinting into the dusk. Something moved at the tree line, a shadow too big, too real. A bear. Her pulse hammered, fear clawing up her throat. Had she saved cubs only to die under the claws of one now? The shape stepped closer, moonlight catching its fur, black, thick, scarred, a small mark above the right eye. She froze. Misha, her Misha, grown massive, a tower of muscle and power, his breath steaming in the air. Those eyes, dark, steady, the same ones that had stared at her by the fire, locked onto hers. He remembered. "Misha," she rasped, half dazed, half hoping. He lumbered toward her, each step shaking the ground, and she flinched despite herself. What was he now? Friend or predator? But then he stopped, lowering his great head, nudging her with a gentleness that defied his size. His fur was warm against her cheek, a lifeline in the cold. She didn't think, couldn't think. Her hands, trembling with pain and disbelief, grabbed fistfuls of his pelt. "Please," she whispered, and he moved. It was slow, agonizing. Misha dragged her, his strength steady but careful, her broken leg trailing uselessly behind. The snow scraped her skin, the pain a white-hot scream in her mind. But she clung to him, her fingers knotted in his fur. The cabin loomed closer, its door a beacon of survival. She didn't know how he understood, didn't know why he'd come. All she knew was the rhythm of his steps, the heat of his body against hers, the impossible truth sinking in. He was saving her. The door banged open under his weight, and he pulled her inside, collapsing her onto the floor by the hearth. Warmth washed over her, weak but alive, as she lay there, chest heaving, staring at him. Misha stood over her, his bulk filling the room, his eyes unreadable. "You came back," she murmured, her voice breaking. He huffed, a deep rumbling sound, and turned, vanishing out the door as quickly as he'd appeared. She wanted to call after him, to ask why, to beg him to stay, but her strength was gone. She crawled to the fire, stoking it with shaking hands, and sank against the wall, her leg throbbing, her mind reeling. Days passed in a haze of pain and fever. She splinted her leg with wood and cloth, surviving on stale bread and willpower, too stubborn to die. The storm returned, howling outside, but she was safe because of him. And then one night, she saw them. Through the window, 3 shadows moved at the forest's edge. Yuri, Sasha, Misha, grown and wild, their silhouettes stark against the snow. They didn't approach, didn't enter, just watched. Her heart swelled, an ache she couldn't name. They hadn't forgotten. They were out there, guarding her from afar, their presence a silent promise woven into the wind. She healed slowly, her leg knitting itself back together with time and grit. Life settled into its old rhythm, wood to chop, water to fetch. But it wasn't the same. She'd look out at the trees, searching for those shadows, feeling their eyes on her even when she couldn't see them. They'd saved her once, repaid a debt she hadn't known she'd given. But as winter faded and spring crept closer, a new unease stirred in her gut. The forest was restless, tracks too big, too fresh, circling her land. Poachers again, or something worse? She gripped her rifle tighter now, her gaze lingering on the horizon. They were out there, her bears. And somehow she knew this wasn't the end of their story. Not yet. The forest was restless. Elena Mirova felt it in her bones. The air too thick, the silence too heavy, the tracks circling her land too bold. Spring had come and gone since Misha dragged her from the snow, her leg healing into a stiff, stubborn limp. She'd seen them since then, brief glimpses of Yuri, Sasha, and Misha, their massive forms weaving through the trees, watching her from a distance. They were her shadows, her guardians, a bond she couldn't explain but couldn't deny. But now something darker stirred beyond the pines. The tracks she'd found, deep, deliberate, human, weren't just passing through. They were hunting, and her gut screamed it wasn't deer they were after. Summer hit hard, unnatural heat baking the Siberian wilds. Elena sat on her porch, fanning herself with a rag, her rifle propped beside her. The horizon shimmered, the air dry as bone. She'd heard rumors from Ivan, the ranger, when he'd last brought supplies. Foreign hunters, rich ones, had bribed their way into the forest chasing black bears for sport. Her pulse quickened at the thought. Yuri, Sasha, Misha. Could it be them? She scanned the tree line, her gray eyes sharp despite the years. Nothing moved. Yet. Then Ivan came again, his truck rattling up the thawed path, his face tight with urgency. "Elena," he said, stepping out, his voice low. "Trouble." She straightened, gripping the porch rail. What kind? He rubbed his neck, hesitating. Hunting party, foreigners, paid off some locals. They're tracking a bear family, 3 of them, near the old ravine. The words punched her chest. The ravine, where she'd found the cubs. Her breath caught. How far? 15 kilometers east, he said, but they're armed to the teeth. Elena, you can't... She didn't hear the rest. She was already moving, grabbing her coat, her rifle, a small pack. Ivan shouted after her, "You're crazy, you'll get yourself killed." But she didn't care. Some things were worth the risk. She limped into the forest, her leg protesting, her heart pounding with a fear she hadn't felt since that icy fall. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows as she pushed deeper, following the ravine's pull. Hours bled away, her boots sinking into soft earth, her breath ragged. Then, a gunshot, loud, close. She froze. Another. Silence. Her blood ran cold. She moved faster, ignoring the ache, the rifle heavy in her hands. Branches snapped underfoot, the air thick with pine and dread. Then she saw them. Boris, Misha's new name in her mind, a fierce protector, stood at the ravine's edge, blood matting his fur, his breath heaving. Beyond him, 2 hunters sprawled in the dirt, one out cold, the other fumbling with a rifle, his hands shaking. Natasha, Sasha grown strong, crouched nearby, her growl low. Misha, still Misha to her, tensed, ready to lunge. Elena acted. She fired into the air. The crack echoed, sharp and final. The hunter flinched, dropping his ammo, his wide eyes darting to her, an old woman, frail but fierce, standing between him and death. "Go!" she barked, her voice steel. He hesitated. The bear stepped forward, a wall of muscle and fury. He ran, stumbling over his partner, crashing through the brush. Silence fell, heavy and electric. Elena turned to Boris. He stared back, trembling from the fight, his dark eyes locked on hers. Natasha and Misha flanked him, waiting. She felt it, a shift, a farewell in the air. "Go," she whispered, softer now. Boris held her gaze, then turned, leading them into the trees. They were gone. She stood there, rifle sagging, her chest tight. They'd saved her once. Now she'd save them. But the forest wasn't done with her yet. Days later, the fire came. It started small, a wisp of smoke on the horizon, a faint crackle in the distance. Then the wind turned, feeding it, driving it toward her cabin like a starving beast. Elena smelled it first, acrid, choking, then saw the glow through the trees. She was on the porch when it hit, flames roaring, heat blasting her face. Too old to run, too slow to fight. The cabin, her home, her life, was doomed. She grabbed her rifle, a blanket, and stumbled outside, smoke stinging her eyes. The fire was everywhere, swallowing the pines, racing closer. She coughed, her lungs burning. This was it. Then, shadows. 3 of them, massive, bursting through the haze. Boris, Natasha, Misha. They were back. No time to think. Boris shoved her, his bulk forcing her to move. Natasha pressed against her side, grunting, shielding her from the heat. Misha took the rear, his eyes on the flames. They didn't run downhill, didn't head for the river like she'd expected. They led her deeper, through twisting paths, damp hollows, rocky outcrops where the fire faltered. She stumbled, blind in the smoke, trusting them. How did they know? How could they? Her legs screamed, her breath came in gas. The heat was unbearable, the roar deafening. She tripped, hitting the ground hard. Misha was there, nudging her up, his fur singed but steady. "I can't," she rasped. He pushed harder. She ran, lungs on fire, heart bursting, matching their pace. The flames chased them, licking at their heels. Then, a break, a clearing, untouched, the air cool. Elena collapsed, knees buckling, alive. She turned, expecting them to follow. They didn't. They stood at the edge, framed by firelight. Boris huffing, Natasha panting, Misha watching. Their eyes met hers, dark and deep. They'd done it again, saved her. But this wasn't their place. The wild called. Boris gave a low rumble, a sound heavy with meaning. Then they turned, vanishing into the burning forest. She reached out, a sob catching in her throat, but they were gone. Dawn broke over a smoldering ruin. Rescue crews found her in the clearing, soot-streaked, staring where her bears had disappeared. Her cabin was ash, her life reduced to embers. But she lived because of them. They'd repaid her kindness 1,000 times over. Yet as she sat there, the weight of their absence crushed her. Were they safe? Had the fire taken them? She didn't know, not yet, but the claw marks she'd find later, deep, deliberate, etched around the ashes, would tell her more. Their story wasn't over, not while she still breathed. Smoke lingered in the air, a bitter veil over the blackened remains of what had been Elena Mirova's world. The forest stood silent now, its roar of flame reduced to a whisper of ash and wind. She sat in the clearing where Boris, Natasha, and Misha had left her knees drawn to her chest, her face streaked with soot and tears. The rescue crew had come and gone, boots crunching, voices buzzing, offering blankets, food, a ride to the village. She'd refused. This was her home, or what was left of it. The cabin was gone, its logs charred to dust, its memories swallowed by the fire. But she was alive, because of them. She replayed it in her mind, their shadows bursting through the smoke, their strength guiding her through the inferno. Boris's shove, Natasha's shield, Misha's nudge. They'd known the way, threading a path through the chaos she'd never have found alone. Her hands trembled as she brushed the dirt, her fingers tracing the edge of the clearing. She'd lost everything, decades of solitude, of survival. Yet she'd gained something more, a bond forged in frost and flame, a debt that ran both ways. But where were they now? Had the fire spared them, or had it claimed them as it had her home? The question gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. The sun climbed higher, weak light filtering through the haze. Elena stood, her legs stiff from the old break, her body heavy with exhaustion. She limped toward the ruins, each step a quiet defiance. The crew had warned her. Nothing left to salvage, nothing worth staying for. They didn't understand. She needed to see it, to feel it, to know. The air stung her lungs, thick with the scent of burnt pine, as she reached the edge of what had been her porch. Ash crunched under her boots, soft and final. Then she stopped, her breath catching. A circle stood out in the devastation, a patch of earth, untouched, surrounded by the fire's wrath. Grass still clung to life there, green against the black, and at its center, claw marks, deep, deliberate, gouged into the soil, the trees, the rocks. Her heart thudded, a slow, heavy beat. She knelt, her fingers hovering over the gashes. Too big for a fox, too precise for chance. Boris, Natasha, Misha. They'd been here, before the fire, before they'd let her out. She traced the marks, her hands shaking, not from cold, but from the weight of it. They'd tried to save her home, cleared the ground, torn away fuel, built a crude shield against the flames. For her, tears welled, hot and silent, spilling down her weathered cheeks. She sank to the ground, pressing her palm to the earth where their claws had been. Had they known the fire was coming? Had they smelled it on the wind, felt it in their bones? She saw them in her mind, Boris tearing at branches, Natasha dragging leaves, Misha pacing the boundary. They'd fought a force they couldn't stop, not for themselves but for her bears, her family. She'd saved them once, tiny and helpless in that frozen shed. They'd saved her again and again, through snow, through fire, through the wild's cruel hand. Some debts, she realized, weren't meant to be repaid. They just were. Weeks passed, slow and gray. The villagers came, strangers moved by whispers of her story, bringing logs, tools, hands to rebuild. They worked in quiet awe, stealing glances at her as she watched from the sidelines, her rifle propped nearby. The new cabin rose, sturdy and simple, a shadow of the old. She thanked them with nods and tea, but her eyes stayed on the trees, waiting. The first snow fell, dusting the scars of the fire, softening the world into stillness. She'd sit by the edge of the forest each morning, her breath curling in the cold, searching for them. Nothing. No tracks, no shadows. Had the fire driven them too deep? Were they gone for good? Then one evening, as the sun bled gold behind the pines, she heard it, a deep, familiar huff. Her head snapped up, her heart lurching. There they were, Boris, Natasha, Misha, emerging from the dusk, their fur singed in patches, their bodies lean but alive. She exhaled, a shaky sound, pressing a hand to her chest. They'd survived. They'd come back. She stepped forward, no fear, no hesitation. They moved closer, stopping just feet away, their dark eyes meeting hers in a silence that spoke louder than words. Boris dipped his head, slow and deliberate, a gesture she'd never forget. Natasha and Misha stood beside him, steady, unyielding. For a long moment, they held her gaze, the air thick with something ancient, something no one could name. "You're home?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She swore they understood. Then as the light faded, they turned. 3 great shadows melting into the forest, gone as quietly as they'd come. She didn't call after them this time. She let them go, a tear slipping free, freezing on her cheek. The story spread, wildfire fast, beyond the Siberian wilds. Journalists came, notebooks in hand. Scientists set up cameras, hungry for proof. They called it impossible. Bears guarding a woman, fighting for her, loving her. Some scoffed, called it myth. But those who'd lived the wilderness, who'd heard its whispers, knew better. The cameras caught glimpses, claw marks on trees, patrols at night. The bears hadn't left. They roamed, hunted, lived wild as they should, but they always returned. Silent sentinels marking her land, keeping threats at bay. Elena grew older, her hair whiter, her steps slower. She'd sit on her new porch, watching those shadows move between the pines, a faint smile on her lips. She'd come here alone, fleeing a world that broke her. She'd thought solitude was her fate. She'd been wrong. They'd found her, 3 cubs in a storm, 3 guardians in the dark, and shown her something greater than family, stronger than fear. As winters passed, she no longer dreaded the end. She'd lived a life of loss, of silence, but never alone. Not truly. One autumn night, weaker now, she sat outside, wrapped in a shawl, the leaves gold and rust around her. A crunch of paws broke the stillness. She looked up, her smile soft. There they stood, Boris, Natasha, Misha, at the forest's edge, watching. She raised a trembling hand. They lowered their heads one by one. A thank you, a goodbye. Then they turned, vanishing into the wild. She closed her eyes, peace settling over her like snow. Were they still out there? Would they come again if she needed them? She didn't know, didn't need to. Some bonds didn't end. They lingered, etched in claw marks, whispered in the wind, alive in the wild forever. The tale of Elena Mirova and her bears, Boris, Natasha, and Misha, is more than a miraculous journey between human and nature. It's a testament to the power of kindness and loyalty that defies all boundaries. From a freezing blizzard to a fire that consumed everything, they found each other, saved each other, and left behind a legacy etched forever in the winds of Kamchatka. Each claw mark in the earth, each distant gaze, reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places. Did this bond touch your heart? If it did, hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel right now. Join us for more inspiring stories of courage, connection, and the wild's untamed beauty. We'll see you in the next video.